Welcome to Counterplan competition. For people who think Counterplan competition is boring, I am going to start with my pitch to you for why to think about Counterplan theory as something more than Counterplan competition theory as something more than the most boring part of debate. And then we are going to talk about the big picture and kind of a little bit of Counterplan history. We're going to define models of competition and discuss their various advantages and drawbacks. We're going to talk about what competition debates look like. We will talk about the relationship between competition and theory, and if we have time, we will talk through an example, and feel free to ask questions as we go. So my pitch to you for the top 2 reasons to think about Counterplan competition beyond being kind of the part that puts you to sleep is 1, competition is about models of debate. It speaks to the question of what debates ought to look like. So is anyone in here someone who likes topicality? Okay, that's great. That gives you all of the fundamentals and all of the pieces that you need to be someone who also likes Counterplan competition. The second kind of big picture argument that I'll make is that it gets at the heart, Counterplan competition gets at the heart of what policy debate is and what the affirmative and negative burdens are. Like, what are we doing here? What are we requiring of the affirmative? What do we expect of the negative in response? So those are my 2, like, it is cooler than you think. That is not that cool. That's okay. It is still worth learning about. So big picture in Counterplan history. We're going to zoom out and go kind of meta for a minute. What is a counterplan? Penelope. Okay, I'm going to start with the second part of what you said. So it's an alternative advocacy or proposal that is not the affirmative plan that we say would be preferable to the affirmative plan. So why does the negative get to advocate for counterplans? The affirmative has a resolution that derives, from which it derives its burden and its requirements. There is no negative resolution, so where does it come from that we think that the negative gets to introduce counterplans? Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. So we can't determine whether the plan is a good idea without comparison to alternatives, right? So counterplans introduce alternatives that we can compare to action of the plan in order to determine whether it is a good idea. Now, why is a counterplan a reason to vote negative? And now I'll go back to Penelope because I skipped over the first part of what you said. Go ahead and say it again. Great. What does that mean? Sure.
Doing the ask or stops you from doing the better option, which is there is a better idea.
Right. So opportunity cost is borrowed from economic theory and refers to the idea that when we decide what something costs, we must add up the costs of the foregone alternatives in addition to whatever direct costs are incurred by that particular option. For a counterplan to be a reason to vote negative, it must constitute a reason to reject the plan, or put differently, absent some offensive component, a counterplan is just defense, right? Is that making sense to everyone? So I don't know a ton about counterplan theory. I intend to learn. This is like a side project that I want to undertake. I do know that counterplans definitely existed by the 1940s because there's an article discussing counterplans, qua counterplan from 1943. However, the article makes it very clear that uptake is not universal, so everyone is not out here reading counterplans in the 40s. For a few decades, the kind of academic work on counterplan theory implied that it's all sort of a relatively radical new debate innovation of which some people are still skeptical, largely for the reason that I flagged at the top, that there is no negative resolution. So counterplan is certainly not automatic or intrinsic feature of policy debate as it was constructed, but evolved over time to become very important. Today, we accept counterplans as a fact of life, right? But if you are living your life trying to win a solvency deficit to every counterplan you hear, you are going to have a rough time. There are counterplans designed to be so deviously that no solvency deficit could possibly apply. And importantly, theoretical objections to those counterplans are most compelling when they are coupled with a push on why the counterplan is not an opportunity cost to the plan. Conversely, if you are a 2N hoping that every counterplan you read will always clearly compete both textually and functionally, and thus you will never have to have a detailed competition debate, you are going to have regrets. So ideally, and hopefully, the concepts that we talked through today will give you some confidence in debates about counterplan competition. Okay, the next section is the most boring. I need you to power through with me. We are going to talk about text and function. So, in modern debate parlance, there are two ways to determine counterplan competition: through text and through function. So text refers to the literal words of a plan or advocacy, and function refers to what the advocacy does. Somewhat intuitively, textual competition means that the plan and the counterplan are mutually exclusive based on the words in the plan and the counterplan. What does mutually exclusive mean? Right, cannot both be done. So the textual competition means that the permutation to do the counterplan severs out of a word or phrase in the plan. And the classic example would be a word pick that takes a word of the plan and excludes it, usually replacing it with a synonym or a different word. So that's textual competition. Functional competition means that the plan and the counterplan are mutually exclusive in practice, such that the plan and the counterplan such that perm to the counterplan severs a function of the plan. So here, the example that I'll give here is the plan increases patent protections by issuing more patents to green tech companies, and it also reforms the PTO to expedite those patents. The counterplan to only reform the PTO but not increase patent protections competes functionally because perm to the counterplan would not strengthen patent protections. Tracking? I'm going to go through the top 3 arguments for and against each of these models, and then we're going to get weird. So the standard reasons textual competition is a preferable model. 1, text is objective. We know what the words are, so we can clearly identify what does and does not sever. The plan is the most stable and most predictable locus for debate. Second, textual competition forces better plan writing. If the AF knows they will be forced to defend each word that they put in their plan, they will write their plans more carefully, so we pretend. Third is that textual competition screens out or excludes counterplans like consultation, which only compete functionally but can never compete textually. The argument for why a consultation counterplan competes is that it includes the possibility of not doing the plan, right? That's the standard issue. It is functionally competitive because it includes the possibility that we do not do the plan. And so perm do the counterplan severs the fact that we are fiating the plan. So those are the top 3 reasons textual competition is preferable. I'll add here an argument that I don't think is particularly offensive, but that I think is important, which is that text is function. Remember the example that I just gave about the counterplan that I described as functionally competitive because it expedites the patents but doesn't increase protection? Well, how do we know that that is a function of the plan? Because of the text. So text is function. We can get into depth about that, but I think it is, whenever you are thinking about competition, I always have that in the back of my mind. Top 3 reasons textual competition is a bad model. First, it incentivizes vague plan texts. So remember, we claimed that if the AF knows they'll be forced to defend each word, that they'll be more careful. Well, the real competitive incentives there is to use fewer words in the plan with a broader range of potential meanings, right? Because then it insulates the AF from certain counterplans, and that is competitively incentivized by this model of competition. Second, textual competition is artificial. The argument is that textual competition ignores function or says only the words matter and says that what in practice actually happens is irrelevant. Third, textual competition justifies word picks. We talked about word picks as the sort of OG example of a textually competitive counterplan. If we decide that we are operating according to textual competition, we are saying that those are inbounds. We are saying word picks are in, and many people are militantly opposed to that prospect, which I think is like very funny and sort of ridiculous, but we'll talk about that later. Standard reasons functional competition is good. First, it is most logical. There's a sense in which mutual exclusivity can only be conceptualized by thinking about function. Second, and certainly related, it is most real world. People in policy decision-making positions would not forego a particular action because someone proposes an alternative whose text is mutually exclusive with that action. So see the word picks example again, right? It is not particularly realistic to imagine that an alternative proposal to a plan would be, we have subbed in a different word and that is, mutually exclusive with what you have said. Third, functional competition avoids word scramble permutations. So if we are debating what the plan and the counterplan actually do, we aren't playing word games to construct permutation arguments. The standard reasons that functional competition is bad. First, function is arbitrary. It is subjective. It is difficult to determine. So who is to say what a function is and what the various discrete functions of a plan and a counterplan are? Like, where do we derive that from? That is sort of a non-rhetorical question, but it's mostly a rhetorical question. Second, functional competition shifts focus away from the plan. So kind of the, cousin argument to the reason textual competition would be good. We got to focus on the plan. The plan is all we've got. For the love of God, please let us debate about the plan. And third, functional competition excludes a legitimate set of counterplans that ought to compete. And that is sort of like a tautological argument, as I just phrased it, that is one of the embedded reasons for any model of competition is that it excludes a set of counterplans that ought to be litigated, ought to be part of debate. And that is sort of like a top-level thought that I want you to consider, which is that any competition debate will include debates that include discussion not only of the counterplan you are debating, but also the set of counterplans that your model of competition would produce, and whether that set of counterplans is good or bad for debate. So remember when I made that topicality analogy, it is very, very similar to a T debate insofar as you are debating what debate would look like under your model and why it is good or bad based on the arguments that are incentivized or produced by that model. Does that make sense? Questions so far? I kind of blitzed through these like textual and functional competition good, bad arguments because I think that it is important to have a foundation in what we're talking about and what they mean, but I think that fundamentally your competition debating should be a good deal more nuanced. So you will sometimes hear that the AF say that counterplans must compete both textually and functionally, right? Why might the AF stake out this position? Go ahead.
Because they can disprove that it's like only textually competitive but not functionally competitive. They can say that the counterplan has no offense or the other way around, it's not textually competitive.
I agree that the AF, this interpretation is strategic for the AF because it only requires you to win that counterplan is illegitimate in, according to one interpretation or model, so totally agree. What are the reasons that is a good interpretation or model? Yeah.
Because inside that both like the word pick offense as well as like the counterplan, like focusing only on textual competition or functional competition is bad on its own ways, but focusing on both of them like excludes the bad things from both of those things first.
Okay, so what are the bad things?
like counterplan, like word picks for example, only focusing on textual competition. And functional is like I don't have an example, but it's just like those counterplans who are supposed to
It screens out bad counterplans because all of the good counterplans compete both textually and functionally. I hear you. I would love to hear an example. Everyone, this is in so many 2ACs that people say this. I want to hear an example of a counterplan that is included under your model and a counterplan that is excluded under that model. Go ahead, Penelope.
You get a counterplan that, or like get rid of picks that are like small, and then you say DDI except for XYZ, because that's not textually competitive, but then you include counterplans that are like, instead of, like if the app was like something on this topic, if the negative counterplan was like investment or something, it's entirely different. You could separate out towards the plan and get textual competition. So like you wouldn't have random picks that are totally different for the app.
So I agree with you that this interpretation excludes most picks. I disagree with you that that is a good thing. Go ahead. What in the world? So why is it the case that you think this interpretation excludes small picks?
Because like picks where you have to say the whole plan and then say except flaw, like something. It's not. I don't think that's just a badly written tag.
I agree with Hudson. So it certainly, and this is an important takeaway because this is why we're here. Never write a pick that says except for. Never write a pick that says do the plan except in certain cases. For this exact reason that, it very obviously does not compete under, a textual interpretation, which is never a position that you want your counterplan to be in. I have a bunch, well, not a bunch, but a couple of just do's and don'ts sprinkled throughout here. So that is under the category of don't. Another example, and people are often super tempted, so like a condition counterplan. People are super tempted to write their conditions counterplans as do the plan if and only if China agrees or whatever. That is not textually competitive. You have made yourself vulnerable to a theory argument that ought not apply. Does that make sense? So we should be writing our counterplans to be textually competitive whenever possible. Pro tip, jot that down. Okay, so far we've gotten textually and functionally competitive excludes small picks. Any other reasons we think that is a good AF interpretation? I guess that captures sort of the core of the argument, which is that people think that counterplans ought to, be legitimate under any model. So that's the idea that we're going for. What are the negative objections to this standard? Or what might they be? Yeah, go ahead.
Very little room for counterplans. Like the example you just asked, what counterplans work under that model. Also, all the against reasons to both textual and functional apply. So you have double the problems.
That's interesting, yeah. So all of the problems with textual and functional competition, become, you could say they become salient if you are requiring both. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Go ahead.
There's also random counterplans that arbitrarily become competitive. If you could insert the word not into the plan and say you don't do something, or the United States government should not do whatever, it would be textually competitive. So the active term could win a term on the opposite of the resolution.
Right, yeah. So enables the AF to permute like ban the plan, which is a version of should not do that. I agree with that. I think that that is all true. So I think it's important to have a foundation in these arguments. It is important to write some blocks that stake out some positions for you on the model of competition that you think is abstractly most beneficial. But the biggest bottom line or takeaway that I want you to leave here today with is that the best competition debates are highly tailored to the relevant counterplan at hand. So like we are self-evidently not getting a ton out of this abstract discussion of like what are the good counterplanes that textual and functional lets in, what are the good counterplanes that excludes. It's like it's all kind of hard to like concretize in the abstract, and so your arguments about competition should be highly tailored to the counterplan at hand. Side note that is here in that I wasn't sure where else to put it. When writing your plan, this is not like do and don't, but it's a don't. Resist the temptation to include that the plan strengthens its protection of domestic intellectual property rights, which is the phrase in the resolution. We should not put that in our plan under any circumstance, because the inclusion of that resolutional language makes the offsets counterplan competitive where it otherwise should not be. So, just a thought. And in general, I have just like an instinctive, absolute gut reaction when people say that they're going to do the resolution by plan, and that is because you can pick out of doing the resolution. So never do the resolution by plan. Hardly not. Okay, questions. What counterplan competition debates look like? So in competition debates, the AF and NEG are approaching the question of competition from opposite angles along the same axis. I don't actually know if that is a mathematically accurate way of describing this, but it is how I thought about it. So each side is looking for non-arbitrary ways to render the counterplan either competitive or not competitive, and looking for offense attached to that model. So again, you're having something that is very akin to a typical topicality debate, even though it's happening within the line by line on the counterplan instead of on its own sheet, which I think is also what is part of what makes competition debating hard for people, is that they're used to T-debates where it's all, you have like all the room in the world to like spread things out, put it in different places, have sort of like a bunch of different, components to what is going on, all on its own flow, whereas counterplan competition debates are that, but it's all scrunched into the line by line of the counterplan. So I'm going to talk about organization in a couple of minutes, but that is, just something to contemplate. So the abstract arguments about functional competition and their relative textual versus functional competition and their relative benefits are less compelling than detailed, nuanced arguments about the particular counterplane you are debating. You want to give the judge reasons to prefer your model of competition based on the relative merits to the counterplan at hand. And conversely, the AF wants to exclude the counterplan at hand by way of presenting a model of competition that precludes it. The terms textual and functional competition are useful shorthand, but they must not be used to substitute for explanations of what debate ought to look like and what it does look like under your model. So what this means for the affirmative, it means you want to make permutations with complete texts and a defense of that permutation. And by defense of that permutation, I mean you want to include the arguments about why it is not either severance or intrinsic, and to the extent that it can be considered either intrinsic or severance, that is still legitimate and good in this context. I only just realized I failed to define severance and intrinsic. Let's do that real quick. So when I said the permutation, when I was doing text versus function and what those models mean in terms of the perm, what does severance mean? Mm-hmm.
Severance as a part of affirmative.
Okay, you used the word sever to define severance. Let's not do that.
Like the permutation takes out a part of the plan.
Yeah, I would phrase it as the permutation excludes words that are in the original plan text, or excludes functions that are in the original plan. And what is that? And how do you figure it out without text? I don't know. What is intrinsic? Lane?
It includes the perm that includes something that is not in the plan or the category.
Right. Good. So severance and intrinsic. Make sure we're on top of those. So the affirmative wants to present permutations that are neither severance nor intrinsic, or to the extent that they are those things, those are good in this context. The common way that this is done, and I think that this is a relatively recent evolution that's actually a fairly good one, is to label what the permutation does, like what function it's playing in the debate, and then insert the text in the speech doc. So if you want to, read a functionally intrinsic but textually legitimate permutation, say, functionally intrinsic perm, go ahead and let them know it's fine. You can also label it other ways if you want to be a little bit more sneaky about what you're doing, but most, competent debaters will know exactly what is happening. So I think labeling the permutation and then including the full text in the speech document is the way to get this permutation both communicated to the judge about what it is doing and, has a stable reference point in a speech document for exactly textually what it says. And again, note that we care about textually what it says, so it's almost like text matters. Permutations do not have to be topical. This is not an argument that you necessarily need to make in the 2AC, but it is an important frame for when the negative claims that a particular permutation is severance on the basis of a resolutional word or phrase that is not in the plan. So, I am orienting all of this around, I think that the competition debating should be done in the context of permutations, and that lends itself to the negative reading a stack of cards that say that severs because this resolutional phrase means X. And sometimes, there's cases where the F is just like, oh, gee, I'm so sorry. And you don't want to do that because permutations do not have to be topical. What this means for the negative. You must have a theory of competition that establishes what makes your counterplan competitive and a defense of that model of competition. So a lot of critique debates these days have theories of power. Counterplans have theories of competition. You must be able to prove affirmative permutations illegitimate except for permutations that self-evidently link to your offense. So that's the two sets of responses to permutations, either substantive arguments about why the permutation still causes the offense, or theoretical objections that screen out that permutation's legitimacy. And I think sometimes you want framing for a particular permutation. Just as a random example, permutations don't need to be topical, but they cannot result in net anti-topical action. I believe that with my whole heart. I believe that permutations cannot result in anti-topical action. Changed my mind. We'll talk about it. We'll get there. Questions so far? Organization. So keep competition debates as organized as possible. They are inherently somewhat difficult to flow because they are information dense and have very few cards to break up the analytics, so you want as much internal structure as possible. That means that the AF should make a set of discrete permutations connected to defenses of that model, and the negative should answer those permutations where they're made on the line by line while making relevant cross applications. Read evidence to support your interpretation. You are usually reading evidence that defines particular resolutional words, sometimes you will be reading cards that define words that are in the plan. The negative also may want to read evidence that supports the broader competition theme. So for example, here is a card that the distinction around which the counterplan hinges is one that scholars in the field consider to be an important debate. That constitutes a reason that the AF should have to debate that counterplan, and excluding it would be anti-educational. Evidence in support of the notion that the counterplan is a relevant opportunity cost to the affirmative are very, very useful. Sometimes you also see a card on something like my, obsession that text is function. And there's like a couple of cards floating around out there that make that argument. I'm sort of agnostic on whether I think you need a card to make that argument. But, it is certainly a possible piece of evidence that you can read. I could certainly go the rest of my life without ever hearing the word should means immediate ever again. But, sometimes you got to do what you got to do, I guess. I'm actually not sure that I believe that you got to do what you got to do in that case. I think there should be ways to win something like a consultation counterplan is competitive and legitimate without resorting to an absolutely anti-logical interpretation of what the word should means. On that note, one question I get a lot is how the AF should deal with debates where the negative block unloads with definition cards on a perm. So in an ideal world, you would counter-define each word the same way that you would in a topicality debate, which does require line-by-lining the 2 and C or 1 and R on those definitions. So if you have counter definitions for all of those words, you should go ahead and read them. And you should do it line by line on the place where the negative did it. Second, you want to make use of grouping. This can be particularly useful, like I just said, where you don't have counter definitions. You can group the definitions that the negative reads and explain why they ought to be rejected, particularly because, again, it all ties back and matters only insofar as it produces a model, and you can win that that model is good or bad, even if you do not have evidence for every detail of your model. Does that make sense? So some of this is like systematizing and framing what is going on for the judge. You really want to extend the reasons that your model of competition is preferable to the negatives, and you want to be comparative with the negatives' warrants in favor of their model. Okay, questions about any of that? Organizational questions? Okay, competition and theory. So, the F wants competition and theory to be strictly distinct questions. A counterplan can be competitive, but not legitimate, and it can be theoretically legitimate, but not competitive. This is logically accurate. It is certainly the case that a counterplan can be demonstrated to compete with the F in the sense that it is mutually exclusive, but can still be bad for debate. Those things can both be true. A counterplan could also be determined to be educationally valid and fair for the F to debate, but still fail the test of competition that determines whether it is a genuine opportunity cost to the affirmative. The negative wants competition and theory to be wedded and collapsed into one question, i.e., winning that the counterplan is competitive makes it legitimate theoretically, and winning that the counterplan is theoretically legitimate militates that we should render it competitive. And the negative's argument here is that it is illogical and arbitrary to exclude a counterplan that is deemed to be valid either theoretically or competitively on the basis of the other. So if the counterplan is competitive, it demonstrates a genuine opportunity cost to the affirmative, which means that the F should have to debate it. And a theoretical model that excludes it would be both anti-educational and would be unfair for the negative. And if a counterplan is theoretically legitimate, it is then necessarily an argument that the AF ought to debate. And a model of competition that boxes it out would also be anti-educational and unfair for the negative. So on both the AF and the neg, it is important that you attend to this question. And it will be most compelling if you can identify arguments for your side that are unique and specific to the counterplan you are debating. Makes sense? Okay, I want to spend some time on an example. I have been thinking a lot about the genre of counterplan that bans patents, trademarks, or copyright. I think that the best affirmatives have good built-in angles against those counterplans, but even then, my belief is that this set of arguments should be legitimate sources of offense for the negative. I do not know whether this belief is necessarily shared by the high school judging community. That is why I want to use this example to talk through. So I'm going to use the plan. The United States federal government should restore the presumption of irreparable harm for patent infringement litigation. You with me? The counterplan prohibits patent protections. And the net benefit in this example is that pharmaceutical patents stifle innovation, causes disease impact. Where are the vibes so far on this counterplan? Just like in the abstract. Vibes are nowhere. The vibes have been shattered. We do not care. We have no thoughts about this counterplan. Just like, what do you think? Yeah. It certainly ought to be. I agree. They certainly should have tons of offense that they can generate. I agree with that. But from a competition and theory perspective, where are you at? The counterplan is the United States federal government should prohibit patent protections. Let's start with the 2AC says perm do the counterplan. Yes.
It's functionally competitive.
Say more. Say more words.
Well, like, the AF inherently, like, strengthens patent protection through increasing reference harm. Meanwhile, the neg, like, prohibits, like, bans like in general, so they are functionally competitive.
I agree with that. Go ahead, Penelope.
I was gonna say, like, it kind of makes sense that they're functionally competitive, but also, if it's prohibiting patent protection to then strengthen, like, I feel like theoretically, even though it sounds kind of weird, you could strengthen protections, but then, or wait,
How could you strengthen protections and also prohibit them?
because the act is not phrased as strengthening protection, sorry, I said that wrong. The act is not phrased as strengthening protections, it's phrased as restore presumption of irreparable harm. So, like, I guess, but then the act would have to win that they're not topical and obviously.
Sure would.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so your proposition is that the permutation that F wants to make is do the plan, then the counterplan. Okay, I'm with you. What objections is the negative going to make? Go ahead. Right, so there's a sequencing dimension to the permutation that is intrinsic because neither the plan nor the counterplan, sequences anything. What do you all think of that argument? You agree? So I agree and disagree with that one. I think it is obviously the argument that you must make on the negative. And I think it is valid, but it is sort of weird to me because, again, textually, if you would simply put the plan and then put the counterplan next to it, and then that is textually not intrinsic, right?
What do you have to put then? That's just going to be both.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So if it just sequences them textually, it doesn't
It's
actually.
like
Okay. Sounds good to me. What else you got? We haven't yet hit on the, yeah. But that's not why the counterplan competes. The AF could defend their permutation by saying that why not? Okay, that's interesting. You certainly could get pretty weird if.
I mean, that wouldn't happen that often, but let's say like it's the night before, like they're about to do like the desk ceiling base,
Okay, so your argument is that competition that has a time element justifies the delay counterplan?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Is there a distinct argument I'm missing there?
I mean, I was trying to like phrase this so they can't like the that can't be like delay counterplans or delay counterplans or not, but like that still doesn't mean like for them to do the plan. Because like, but they can say like delay, the neg can say like delay counterplans or not, but like we can still like we still can't like or like the app can't like delay a non-delay counterplan.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
It's kind of weird because you're affirming pretty much abandoned land,
correct.
but granted, not technically, but it says prohibit patent objectives.
I agree.
So we should agree that whether or not that's good for competition reasons or bad, not sure, but like it's probably true that should is an immediate, and there are examples in which should doesn't have to be a mandate. But in the context of debate, whether or not it should be a mandate, not sure. Like I tell you should do something, that doesn't mean you have to. But like, then what is the point of the app? They don't have to do their own plan.
Amen. I agree with you. Yes.
I was gonna say like term do the app and then create a patents for pharmaceuticals.
Okay, perfect. That is the permutation I really wanted to talk about. So I think that the best permutation against this position is perm do the plan and prohibit pharmaceutical patents. So this is a scenario in which the AF strengthens patent protection because that is a topical requirement for the affirmative, and the counterplan prohibits patent protections, functionally banning the plan, and then has a net benefit that is connected to a particular reason that, or a particular like industry in which patents are bad, that is not something that the 1AC has spoken to, right? We tracking what's happening here? So the 2AC says permutation do the plan and then prohibit pharmaceutical patents, which are what you have said cause the bad stuff, right? Where are we vibes-wise on that? Go ahead.
Is it technically legitimate because you're banning a subset of the counterplan? Or like so it's not intrinsic? Is it part of the counterplan?
The affirmative's argument is that it is functionally legitimate because it is permuting a function of the counterplan. Right, go ahead. Absolutely, it is textually intrinsic. Go on. What are your thoughts about that? Go ahead.
If it's textually intrinsic, but doesn't prove the plan to be a bad idea, I don't think it really matters. Like, in the context where the app does not say that patents are key to some sort of pharma, CRISPR, APR thing, if a counterplan that generates offense on something that's kind of
I hear you. I hear you, and yet the counterplan zaps the plan. So, like, what are we doing here?
That term is fine under the ASP model if they consider a counterplan has to be both function and textually.
It's fine. I agree. It's fine under the APS model. The negative is obviously going to say
It has to be textually or, a counterplan can be textually or functionally competitive, so that would be illegitimate because they just have to prove that it's, or it wouldn't be an illegitimate term, but it wouldn't prove the counterplan's competitive because you need to prove that like it's actually competitive.
why is it not an illegitimate permutation?
Well, I mean, like, I guess any permutation is like considered, I guess, illegitimate, but like, in terms of like testing whether the counterplan is competitive or not, it doesn't do that.
I agree with that. How did we arrive at the permutation to ban pharma patents? Go ahead.
Because of the net benefit,
But how did we pick those words?
because the net benefit is saying that pharma patents kill the pharma industry, and then that triggers like religious impact.
But those words are not in the plan or the counterplan. So no one really like beefed with me about Texas function. Does anyone want to beef with me about that? And I would love for that to happen. Like, tell me text is not function. But if text is function, and we agree about that, adding the function, adding the text, prohibit pharma patents, is adding a function. Go ahead.
It's saying, okay, bear with me for this.
Yeah,
You put should in the plan text. Should doesn't necessarily mean you have to do the plan. And that's
sure.
textually, you would say that maybe it means the plan does or doesn't happen, but the function of the plan is that the plan will definitely happen. So functionally, the plan definitely happens. Textually, it doesn't necessarily have to happen because it's not amended the word should.
Okay.
So text doesn't necessarily equate to function.
Oh, you lost me.
The plan text should doesn't mean that the plan has to happen, but you are saying that the plan has to happen.
Well, that depends on your definition of should.
Under that definition of should.
Yeah, but I think that also, I think the fact that this relies on that your definition of should proves that text is not function.
How does it prove that?
Because, I mean, if you're just saying text is function, then it's just a model of only functional competition, because you could redefine what, like, you can use synonyms and add synonyms to other words in the plan text to make a firm text, if you define a word to be a synonym of something else.
Yeah, I hear you. Go ahead.
In the House of like 3 lecture, and it's like, yeah, you can remove like mandates of the counterplan and prove them. So I think a logical mandate of like a ban IP counterplan with a net benefit that's like it would ban pharma patents, which is good. Is that a logic like a mandate of that would be that we should ban pharma patents.
Yep.
That the permutation is legit because it does the plan and an implicit mandate of the counterplan, which is to prohibit pharma patents.
Yeah, so I think that is a good explanation for the legitimacy of this permutation that I think is like ought to be part of, the like arsenal against this set of stuff. I have 2 things though. How did you determine that that was a mandate of the counterplan?
Based on the net benefit, but also I think it's like the text of the counterplan is that we should prohibit all patents. So I guess the permutation is like a pick out of the mandate that it prohibits a certain subset of that, which means it's not.
So we agree that you determined the mandate based on the text of the counterplan, yeah?
Yeah.
So, I'm just saying. Yeah.
I feel like it also uses the function of the counterplan. Or look at what the like when you mention the net benefit, that means we're not just using the text of the counterplan to generate the like pick competition for the firm, but also the fact that the counterplan, if they get to generate offense off of pharma patents, then either they can't solve for their own net benefit or we get that
Mm-hmm.
That would make it functional.
Unquestionably, well, not unquestionably, it is debatably, this permutation is arguably functionally intrinsic because the plan's result is to strengthen patent protections while the counterplan eliminates them, right? We agree about that? The functional intrinsicness, I think, is fairly marginal because of what you all are saying about where the offense is generated, right? But I do think that the negative should make the argument that it is still functionally intrinsic because of that point. And then, to get another layer weirder, the argument that I made earlier about, resulting in anti-topical action is an argument that I think the negative should also make. I also think that there is something to be said for the notion that prohibiting pharmaceutical patents is an outcome, not a function. It is a result, but we have said we prohibit patent protections. We have said that an outcome of that is that we would get rid of patent protections and that would, pharma patents, and that would be good. We have not isolated our counterplan to a particular function about pharma patents. Thank you for talking through that with me, and happy to keep talking about it. There is just something so fundamentally bonkers to me about the notion that the AF has to say that strengthening intellectual property protections is good, but also gets to say these particular patent protections are bad. And there's I forgot to say this, but there's a reason that I think this counterplan is best when, written in the context of the particular category that the AF is about, right? So I think it is much harder to win in the context of banning all intellectual property rights, and certainly no one thinks that you could ban copyrights against the patents AF, and all of that ought to be relevant. The question of the net effect of patents, is one that I think the AF should have to debate, and I think it is so wild that we just think that the AF can just permute their way out of it, and then our work here is done. That, I encourage you to think another layer deep. Jacob.
There's that tricky little word "or" in the resolution.
Okay. Go on.
I don't think the app has to advocate for the strengthening of patent protection.
But they did because their plan said that they did.
Okay, but their plan didn't say that they strengthened all patent protection.
Okay, so that's a different argument. That's true. But our argument is that the resolutional burden and requirement of the affirmative is to prove that patent protections ought to be strengthened. Or that, intellectual property protections ought to be strengthened. They have chosen the patent area as the category in which they do that. Is it not a legitimate expectation of the affirmative to be able to prove the patents are good? I don't know. I'm not trying to make you all acolytes of this particular notion. I think it is so interesting because we haven't had a topic in a while that so directly raised these questions. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Do you have to defend the patent broadly or just based on the offense?
So I think that, inherently, they only need to prove, what is necessary for the affirmative plan. But I think the burden to not end the debate defending anti-topical action is a good one.
You can't help but get into an argument over strengthen that, right?
Oh, that's true, yes. And that is important to note here. What does strengthen mean? Yeah.
Because it's the total sum action of the affirmative term, all of irreparable harm minus biotech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Absolutely, we should have a card that articulates that it is a net effect, and then we should have a way, it is really weird because, how do you prove the net effect if you result in an irreparable harm standard, ban everything except pharma patents, or ban pharma patents? What is the net effect of that combination? That is a really hard thing to articulate. I don't know.
All counterplans
all counterplan theory is T. Yeah, so I'll let you go, but I think the top 3 takeaways, so you can certainly jot this down if your lab leaders are like, what are the takeaways? Counterplan competition debating should be specific to the counterplan. All counterplan competition debating is actually topicality debating. And number 3, cards are good. Okay, thanks y'all.